In describing the essence of oppression, Fanon said, "The oppressor in his own sphere starts the process, a process of domination, of exploitation, and of pillage. And in the other sphere, the coiled, plundered creature, which is the oppressed, provides fodder for the process as best he can. The process which moves uninterruptedly from the banks of the colonial territory to the palaces and the docks of the mother country." To understand this concept of oppression in depth, the following question can be a helpful guide and being explored in this video. What is oppression? How is it experienced? i.e., its forms and manifestations. How and when it started? Has it remained constant through epochs? Why has it continued for so many millennia, despite undergoing transformations? Who benefit from the system of oppression? What are some myths they propagate about oppression? Is it linked with exploitation? To understand the system of oppression and reality today, we will begin by tracing its roots in history. Of course, in order to build a scientific understanding of the system with the aim of abolishing it and build a new system based on nurturing and cooperation in its place, we must be careful in reading history so as not to read it under the influence of emotion and idealism. According to the popular line of struggle, we will use a scientific materialist methodology to read history, to understand the system without bias. Scientists suggest that modern humans, our species, arose between 260,000 and 350,000 years ago through a merging of populations in Eastern and Southern Africa. Since then, humans have continued on migrating around the world. Due to natural and/or biological causes, the role of women in bearing children was said to mark the first division of labor in human history. That came along with the domestication of fire and animals and the developing knowledge of mastering earth minerals. Changes in history shows us that whenever there is a change in the means of production, it coincides with changes in the dominant ideology of the ruling classes. But these changes do not cut off totally from the old era. In fact, it sustains the same structure while it only changes the mechanism or strategies of power. Later, new inventions, the domestication of animals, pottery, agriculture, and all these and more contributed to a more complex division of labor. This division of labor was not based on sex. With the development of clan and kinship structures, interaction and conflict with other groups, and control over the means of production that were being developed, with the generation of surplus, with wars and the subjugation of other groups that could be forced to work, the process of women's withdrawal from social production seems to have begun. Thus, the means of production and the surplus began to be concentrated in the hands of the clan or tribal chiefs, which manifested itself in male dominance. Whether this control over the means of production remained collective in its form or developed in the form of private property, and whether the formation of classes had been fully completed by this time, it varies from society to society. We must examine the facts of each society individually. Since violence has been present at all times, it has been the main and primitive means on which the ruling class have relied to dominate and subjugate groups of people and to maintain and reproduce this unequal production and distribution in conjunction with development of methods of governance according to the ideology of the ruling class in that society. We see it in the case of women. While family or kinship relations and private property had been increasing patriarchal control over women, the full institutionalization of patriarchy could only come later. That is, the woman's withdrawal from social production, often through violence, its ideological justification, and the confinement of their reproductive role to monogamous relationships could only come after the full development of class society and the emergence of the state. Therefore, through this scientific reading of material history, we can define oppression simply as a method or tool of power by the dominant class or persons, the oppressor, against the dominated classes or persons, the oppressed, in order to maintain the unjust and unequal reality. The definition of oppression, thus, cannot be static in time nor space. Here, Paulo Freire is instrumental in understanding oppression as a relation between the oppressor and the oppressed within a social material context. Freire describes oppression as a process of dehumanization of both the oppressed and the oppressor, and the unequal impact of it on the oppressed as a result. Oppression in society manifests itself in many aspects. There is political oppression, and that can be seen when people are imprisoned for asserting their political rights. There is socio-economic oppression, which can be evidenced in the racialization of certain groups as inferior, and thus designating them to menial and low-paid jobs, such as kafala workers. There is sexual oppression, which is commonly experienced as rape or sexual abuse, and is oftentimes a complex, cyclical, psychological phenomena. Then there is legal oppression, which is exemplified by borders being imposed on a people, forcing their displacement. There is class oppression, which can be seen when employers delay wages, controlling working conditions. There is institutional oppression, where, for instance, certain social groups are prohibited from using public spaces, such as Dalits in India not allowed in temples, or black people made to use separate seats in buses. There is cultural oppression. The best example of it would be when the British Empire changed the language, clothes, a big part of the culture in their colonies. There is religious oppression, which can be evidenced in the religious heads and other powerful figures persecuting other religious minorities, demolishing places of worship, forced indoctrination of all people, including the masses. All these aspects of oppression come in two forms. The first is direct and uses physical or verbal violence, and the second is indirect and operates mostly in the intellectual and philosophical realm of people. Now, in order for the system of oppression to function as planned, in order to serve the privileged, human evolution and its resulting complexities have coincided over the ages with the formation of myths and illusions to mitigate oppression, or to conceal its reality, or to normalize it in the memory of the people in that particular society. Myth, race, gender, class are different, but equal axes of oppression which might intersect for some individuals, i.e., some individuals experience higher degrees of oppression due to the intersection of their race, gender, and class. Counter-narrative. Subjugation of black people and women has been historically linked to class, but the oppressive ideologies of racism or patriarchy have been universalized and removed from their class origins today. In order to be universalized, these ideologies must transcend class boundaries. Thus, we see the practice of ideologies of racism or sexism even among the working classes. Myth. The cause of oppression is rooted in biological determinism, i.e., certain social group oppressed another on account of possession of certain biological traits. For example, men display violent oppression since men were hunters and warriors and their bodies are biologically destined for it. Counter-narrative. There is historical evidence of women playing an important role in hunting, gathering, and other such activities. Thus, women being attributed as weak and vulnerable on account of their biology is bogus. If the cause for oppression as a phenomena is not biologically determined, it must therefore be rooted in the material social context of the epoch. That is, in each society and epoch, oppression must be seen in light of what was being produced, how the produce was being exchanged, consumed, was there a surplus being produced, who was accumulating this surplus, and who was producing this surplus, what relations enabled the production of surplus by some and accumulation by others. How were these relations being reproduced socially and intergenerationally in conjugation with the needs of those accumulating the surpluses? Myth. those who are oppressed cannot oppress others. One is either an oppressed or an oppressor. Counter narrative. Duality of oppressor-oppressed, as explained by Paulo Freire, states that the oppressed suffer from the duality which has established itself in their innermost being. They discover that without freedom they cannot exist authentically. Yet, although they desire authentic existence, they fear it. They are at one and the same time themselves and the oppressor whose consciousness they have internalized. Although oppression takes a specific form under capitalism because of the creation of classes of wage labor and capital, it has existed throughout class society. Forms of social oppression developed in conjugation with the relations of exploitation and have been carried and transformed through various historical epochs and within different modes of production from the beginning of class society. They developed specific to the material conditions and within the framework of the dominant ideology of the society, mostly the ideology propagated by the ruling classes in that epoch. Forms of oppression are an expression of the dominant ideology, working in the service of creating and maintaining institutions that aid and enable exploitation and subjugation of a people whose labor exploitation produces the necessities as well as surpluses for the ruling classes in a given society. But oppression goes far beyond just exploitation of a person's ability to do work. There are sometimes trailing, seemingly anachronistic elements of social oppression from previous epochs that at once seem disconnected from the logic of capitalism as it operates in the contemporary political economy. However, if examined closely, one may discern the ways in which the oppressor capitalist class within its regional or local political economy maintains these practices to control and subjugate, racialize and segregate the laboring masses. Oppression is both a function of class society as well as a product of it. We in the OFM stand strongly with the aim of abolishing oppression in all its forms and aspects, and building a new system based on nurturing and cooperation in its place. However, reading history is a very challenging task, so it should be not read under the influence of emotions and idealism. We have tried to unpack a general understanding of oppression here. But oppression can be understood properly once the oppressed mass of people become conscious of it and unveil it in their resistance the various forms of it. This video will be part of a two-part series on oppression and exploitation as we understand it through historical materialism. All the solidarity and power to the people. Struggle until the people is united and liberated.